And so this is where the marriage between critical pedagogy and critical media literacy really come into play, is that activism. That I think, I study teens in media. That's a big subject area for me. And I think that for young people today, not all by any means, they are not a monolithic population, but I do think that it's very easy to get lost in your phone, get lost in the scroll, that thinking that reposting or retweeting or sharing or that hashtag activism is enough to make change. And what I think critical media literacy allows us to do is it provides pathways to think about an issue and then get engaged, boots on the ground in an issue to work and make change in communities. And that is what's really needed in an election year, is to make sure that you are informed about the issues that you care about, and then you are engaging in advocating for those issues through your vote.
After the 2016 election, I think it was Oxford Dictionary declared post-truth the word of the year, meaning that people are more likely to act on their confirmation bias and their emotional appeals and so forth to what feels like truth becomes truth, and people need to believe it. Whether it was after the 2016 election when the Democrats hatched the Russiagate nonsense that caught on and just spread wildly, especially across MSNBC, where people like Rachel Maddow made it a cottage industry. But years have gone by and that narrative has been debunked, yet it still doesn't die. And of course in 2020 we had another example from the Republican Party with the GOP in the Trump election, where he insisted that Biden didn't win, Biden cheated, led to the stupid coup, as Mark Danner calls it, in many ways. That also is another example of these false narratives getting off leash, because many people wanted it to be true and felt that it was, and then they acted on that bad information. Garbage in, garbage out. That's kind of that kind of leads us back to the issue of civic engagement. When people are inadequately informed, or worse, erroneously informed, and they don't understand or believe that they are, that leads people to make very different decisions. And it may lead people to make desperate or rash decisions, depending upon the degree to which the propaganda is moving them to do that, right? In the case of Trump in the 2020 election, there was pretty brazen type phraseology and terminology used that really impelled people to commit acts of violence, and not just abstractly against property, but against people, and really against the system itself and against democratic principles themselves. And again, back to Democrats and the issue after the 2016 election, they did more damage than I think they may have realized, or to be cynical about it, maybe they did as much damage as they intended. Maybe they really, casting doubt and sowing chaos is a way that you can then come in to restore stability and order, right? And as we approach this next election year, we haven't really moved past these problems. These media ecosystem problems, this disinfotainment kind of system of problems that we have. And I think that this is a really good time for people to become more critically media literate, to explore independent media, to explore independent and alternative media outlets, because more and more, and again, we're coming into another election year in 2024, we're going to see just a blizzard of propaganda and disinformation coming from both sides of the red, the blue. We're going to see the networks line up where they do, although I know that we should be skeptical as we enter another contentious election year that really has looked a lot like, it's very circus-like environment in many ways. But I do think that we should at least apply some degree of hope about what's possible, and through education and through transparent communication, I think we can really maybe begin to turn the tide in many ways, at least in our local communities and the networks in which that we tend to operate.
A critically media literate press and citizenry is able to see past frames, to break frames, to break out of echo chambers and information silos, able to break out of biases. It's very important in an election year because citizens and journalists need to see past the cults of personality and the parties, and to be able to look deeper into what that person the candidate is presenting on their platform, and then be able to see who's funding their campaign, to see what lobbyists are affecting their choices, and be able to kind of project into the future, will this candidate actually go forward on what they're promising, or are they going to be beholden to money to others? We need voters who are willing to do their homework, who are willing to think for themselves, to ask critical questions, to do a deep dive on the candidate that they're planning to vote for, and then to ultimately cast a vote that will best serve the public interest.
I think it's no secret at this point that folks know that people of all ages, young and old and in between, have abandoned legacy media in huge numbers, and they're going to the internet. And there's some problems with that. People think that social media platforms are news outlets. But at the same time, there's a thriving market for these independent journalists who are creating like streaming services or podcasts or their own like Substacks. And obviously that could change. But right now, these folks are drawing a lot of attention and they're being highly influential. And you see like even, sitting Congress people or even people running for office like Ron DeSantis, they're going on these programs. That would not have happened 10 years ago. They would not go on some ragtag podcast or talk to some Substacker. But I think we're starting to see that transition. So this will be an interesting test to see how strong the grip of corporate media is in 2024. Is it going to continue to be the most influential news outlets as it has been the last handful of elections, or will new media be a decisive factor? And that's something I think is interesting in the 2024 context.
The relationship of critical media literacy and the free press to civic engagement is crucial because together they sort of disrupt the fog of corporate media. Independent press and news aggregators are necessary because they cut through the distractions, the propaganda, and the corporate media echo chamber. And we need a diversified media landscape that is not limited to establishment and corporate influence. Without an independent and free press, there is no freedom of speech and there is no freedom of information. And how can you have, an empowered civic engagement when, the public is not truly informed? But this is also by design. I mean, those in power do not want us to be informed because to them, information is a weapon, and a threat to the establishment is a threat to anyone in power. And I think it's time that we recognize that we have power and we have the ability to enact change by simply breaking out of the corporate news cycle and paying more attention to independent press. So hopefully we'll see more of this as we get closer to 2024.
Well, we've gotten to a point where so much of campaign coverage mimics what the candidates say and does very little background to understand what their real voting policies are, or from understanding who these people are. George Santos in the congressional race in New York is a prime example. He said that he went to Baruch College, that he upholded the volleyball team. That is to say that he was, one of the stars of the volleyball team. He said he graduated cum laude. The press completely missed the story that everything about his CV was a lie. It was total embellishments. How difficult would it have been for the legitimate media, the establishment media, to call up Baruch College and find out if he ever attended that school, which he never did. So many aspects of his CV remained unscrutinized, even though a local journalist in Long Island had revealed that story well before he was elected. Only after he was elected did the mainstream media pick up the story, and then Santos was already in the House and causing a lot of problems. So many young people, and really just the voting public, those who would like to have a meaningful vote, simply don't get the information that they want. Our debates, which seem to be the main media platform and the main kind of driver to so much of the election campaigns, are based on soundbite soundbite journalism where candidates repeat the same thing, they don't address the questions, and media do a very poor job of unpacking and analyzing their responses. Instead, mostly they look at their appearance and said, well, especially the presidential candidate, he looked calm. He looked like he could govern. That was a good tie. And so much of campaign discourse is about appearance rather than substance of politicians. So it's so important for the voting public to understand that they need to seek out on alternative sources what these people's voting history are, how that's the only way that you can tell how likely they are to represent their interests when those politicians go to Washington to be part of a representative democracy and do what the citizens and their constituencies want them to do, and what they have indeed promised the people that voted for them. Someone asked George Santos why he lied, and he told them, I wouldn't have got elected if I didn't lie. So we have to be cautious, and we can't just transcribe what these politicians say. We need to offer an analysis of who they are, just not what they look like, to understand who we're voting for and what that vote will mean.
I remember one of the things that really stuck with me that Naomi Klein said, maybe 2 decades ago, was that one of the worst things that commercial journalism tends not to do is to not report on movement successes, particularly from the left. You don't hear about movement successes. You hear about things that change but aren't necessarily, the actual contextualization of it doesn't say this happened because people got together, decided we needed to move a system in this direction, and it worked, it changed, because that kind of thing doesn't get out. It's not just good news for good news. It's very different than that, right? But because there's a disempowerment element to campaign reporting when the reporting you're getting, which generates ratings and clicks, and newsrooms across the country are incorporating, essentially award boards, up here, how many clicks did an article get? Is this thing being shared across social media? When you start to produce coverage that is geared toward that as your metric of success, horse races, all the things we critiqued in the 90s and 2000s, these things intensify. You get horse race coverage that doesn't really tell you much of anything, right? I remember the University of Southern California doing a study of just how much coverage even happened of congressional races in California in the month leading up to a national election, right? You tally up how many minutes per half hour of local news you actually got some coverage of the congressional race for the U.S. House. And I sort of made a bet with my students. How many minutes do you think happened on average every half hour? And they're all very optimistic. They all start guessing something like 3 minutes, and then I try to bring them down. They're like, oh, it's got to be more than 1.5 minutes. And then then you finally get to crush their souls entirely by saying it's like less than 2 seconds, per half hour. So you beat them down to bring them back up after that. So one, like a lot of the decisions that we're going to make in that election, you're not even going to find information about it aboard the channels that, for whatever reason, are still in polls treated as the most trusted. Like local news remains one of those sources. Who knows why is most trusted.
I think critical media literacy and independent journalism go hand in hand in a big way. And that's because I think, once you add sort of critical media literacy to your toolkit, you're then, really motivated to seek out people-centered independent journalism, because that's not what you're seeing in the corporate media. And that's especially important during an election year because, there's proof, there's evidence that horse race journalism, which focuses more on like who's ahead, who's behind, what the polling shows, etc., can actually foster distrust of political candidates and news outlets. And, it leaves people feeling like their vote really doesn't matter at all. So journalism that focuses on the issues that, fundamentally affect people's everyday lives, and understanding where candidates stand on those issues, not only now, but, in the past, is what I think many disillusioned voters might be looking for?
Well, I think it's crucially important because, there is a school of thought that says that if people are taught to view news, corporate, mainstream commercial news with skepticism, then that it just feeds a sort of cynicism that people have about public life, and that will lead people to turn off to involvement in politics. And I don't think that that's the case. What I have witnessed is when students of mine start to develop a critical consciousness about news media, it actually piques their curiosity about social movements that are fighting for justice that may not get coverage in the corporate news media, and become more committed to being involved citizens. So I think it sort of has the opposite effect of what some critics of critical media literacy suggest, that it actually encourages people to get involved. Just on a very concrete level in terms of an election year, there are every year stories that relate to elections that do not get reported in the corporate news media. We're all familiar now with the case of George Santos, who got elected as a Republican representative to Congress from Long Island on the basis of a completely fabricated background. He lied about his education, he lied about his ethnicity, he lied about his accomplishments in business and so on. And now we know that he was sort of using these lies to kind of embezzle money from the Republican Party. So, this is a story that should have been, research, that should have been researched, should have been investigated by the big corporate media. I mean, Long Island is, 30 miles from the center of the American media system in New York City, and yet somehow they missed that story. And I will tell you that I was involved in an organization called Chicago Media Action. And we once, this is now, 15 years ago, brought a challenge to the license renewals of every television station in the city of Chicago when they were up for a renewal before the FCC, on the basis of a study that was done that found that they devoted less coverage to local elections than they did to sports or weather, right? And that was in an election year. And in fact, in election year, there are city council races, state legislative races, not just top of the ballot races. The only races they covered were races for Senate and governor. And the other races were just invisible on television. And broadcasters have a requirement to serve the public interest, community, and necessity. They have an obligation to provide information to citizens, and we found that they weren't doing that. We brought a challenge. Of course, the FCC turned us down, but they kept their licenses.
That's it. So because it's not my election, right? I don't have the right to vote. But I really want to, at least in my political economy of media class, it's kind of really hard to get them to be interested in politics these days, let alone voting, right? But they have to vote because I like to frame election like this. So where do you want your tax dollar to be spent? And at the end of the day, who is in the office decides where your precious dollar that you earned from Chick-fil-A and Publix is get to be spent. Do you want the dollars to be spent on like oil companies subsidizing, or do you want your tax money to be spent on public transportation, for example, right? And do you want your tax dollars to be spent for public school teachers? So I think because we need to make this topic really relatable and topic specific, and ironically, the social media platform and digital platforms are really, really useful platforms to make these kind of big conversation much more relatable and smaller into everyday conversation. So yeah, I think we should be really smart and not to be so much depressed. And yeah, I think given that what happened on Facebook in the past few elections in the US, and this year is going to be really interesting in terms of, because young people, to me, are getting more and more interested in elections and political conversations.
So we're all painfully aware of typical election time media coverage, which basically treats our politics as what many refer to as a horse race. So we get horse race coverage that trivializes what's really on the ballot, which in this coming election year, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that our democracy is on the ballot. So with that in mind, all journalists should be focusing on not just who's up, who's down, what the polls are telling us now, what embarrassing thing one candidate did, or what insult one candidate hurled at another, or what a candidate's wearing. These are the kinds of things that typically are in our election media coverage, but instead really looking at the policy implications. And not only is our democracy on the line, but when we consider the climate crisis, the health of our planet is on the line in this election as well. So I really think everything needs to be framed accordingly to really focus on what the stakes are in this election.
From a democratic point of view, media literacy and is extremely important, especially even more so in an election year, because people need to make their decision at the ballot box. So this means they need to have good and quality information, and they need to be able to distinguish reliable from non-reliable information. So it's important that they use as many sources as possible, as many diverse sources as possible, and also are able to judge what is good and what is non-reliable information. And of course, this is even more true in an election year, because people need to make a very important decision, and every single individual's decision counts. And it's not enough just to believe in one's own beliefs, but also let one's own opinions and convictions get these challenged from time to time. Also get oneself exposed to maybe news and information that one hasn't seen or heard so far. So it's important to try to get exposure to as many diverse sources as possible. From my subjective impression, I have the feeling that US American media broadcasts a lot of very stimulating or sometimes even emotionalizing information, and using very fierce visuals or extreme ways of portraying certain situations. I think in general, German or Japanese media try to go a little bit more balanced way, I would say. But this does not mean that there are no issues at all. But at least what we can say is that in Germany or Japan, we have a very strong public service media there. And by their definition and by their mission, they are obliged to have a more balanced treatment of different topics, and to integrate more diverse and pluralistic point of views. And as they have a very strong standing in society, possibly also the public discourse tends to be a bit less fragmented than as it is in the US. But nevertheless, there is still room for improvement in Japan and Germany as well.